I stood in the freezing, snow-swept courtyard of the Belmont estate, desperately clutching a feverish, shivering 6-year-old orphan to my chest, when Victoria Belmont, heiress and absolute tyrant of the property, personally locked the heavy wrought iron gates on us. She laughed, a sound like breaking glass, telling her wealthy, fur-clad guests that trash belongs out in the snow where it can't stain the marble. She had absolutely no idea that the heavy silver ring hidden beneath my tattered wool gloves belonged to the supreme ruler of the Valerian Empire. She had no idea that I was his sole, long-lost heir. What happened next? Destroyed her entire world. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. I love seeing where this community spans across the globe. To understand the sheer magnitude of Victoria Belmont's mistake, you first have to understand the world we were living in. It was late December in Boston, Massachusetts, the kind of winter that doesn't just chill you to the bone, but seems to actively seek out your soul to freeze it. The Belmont estate, a sprawling palatial mansion set on 40 acres of pristine gated land, was a fortress of old money, immense privilege, and new sharp-edged cruelty. It was a place where a single bottle of wine cost more than my supposed yearly salary, and where the staff were treated not as human beings, but as mildly inconvenient ghosts who were expected to scrub the floors without ever casting a shadow. My name, as far as anyone at the Belmont estate knew, was simply Alara. I was a housekeeper, a glorified servant tasked with maintaining the impossible standards of the East Wing. Every morning at 4 a.m., long before the pale winter sun dared to crest the horizon, I was on my hands and knees, polishing imported Italian marble until it gleamed like a mirror. I spent my days dusting priceless Renaissance tapestries, arranging exotic lilies that were flown in daily from South America and remaining completely, utterly invisible. I did my job perfectly. I never spoke unless spoken to. I kept my head down, my gaze lowered, and my uniform immaculate. I endured the snide comments, the condescending glares, and the endless, exhausting demands with a quiet grace that frustrated my employers. They wanted a reaction. They wanted to see me break, but I never did. Because beneath the rough, calloused exterior of a lowly housekeeper, I carried a secret that would have shattered their delicate, arrogant reality into a million irrecoverable pieces. But I wasn't just working at the estate to hide. I was working there to provide. 3 months prior, during a bitter driving rainstorm in early October, I had found Leo. He was huddled in the dark, damp alleyway behind the estate's massive service kitchens, trying to shield himself with a discarded cardboard box. He was only 6 years old, terrifyingly thin, with massive, haunted brown eyes and a cough that rattled deep within his frail chest. He had been abandoned, left to the mercy of a city that had none. When I found him, he looked up at me with a mixture of profound terror and desperate hope. In that moment, my heart fractured. I couldn't leave him. I smuggled him into my tiny, unheated room in the servants' quarters, a cramped space barely larger than a closet, tucked away in the attic where the Belmonts never ventured. For 3 months, Leo was my entire world. I shared my meager rations with him. I spent every spare penny I earned on cough syrup, warm blankets, and secondhand picture books to teach him how to read by the dim light of a single bulb. He was a sweet, incredibly smart boy who, despite the horrific hand life had dealt him, still knew how to smile. But as the winter deepened, turning Boston into a frozen wasteland, Leo's cough worsened. It morphed into a deep, wet hacking that kept us both awake through the long, freezing nights. His forehead was constantly warm to the touch, a persistent fever that I couldn't break with the cheap medicine from the corner pharmacy. I knew he needed a real doctor. I knew he needed antibiotics, a warm bed, and proper care. But on a maid's salary, constantly docked by Victoria for imaginary infractions, I was completely trapped. Son, Victoria Belmont was the reigning queen of the estate, a 26-year-old socialite whose beauty was entirely superficial, masking a soul that was as cold and hard as a diamond. She was the kind of woman who judged a person's entire worth by the designer label on their clothes and the pedigree of their last name. To her, people like me, and certainly people like Leo, were less than insects. We were a disease, an eyesore that offended her delicate sensibilities. She spent her days planning extravagant parties, berating her staff, and ensuring that everyone in her orbit knew exactly how much power she wielded. The inciting incident, the moment that set the wheels of absolute destruction into motion, happened on the evening of Victoria's highly anticipated winter solstice gala. It was this social event of the season, a gathering of the city's most elite, powerful, and ruthless individuals. The estate had been transformed into a winter wonderland, dripping in crystals, white roses, and shimmering silver lights. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, roasting meats, and the intoxicating buzz of unbridled arrogance. I had been working for 18 hours straight, my body aching with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. I had been relegated to the coat check room, a small, drafty alcove near the grand entrance, tasked with handling the heavy mink coats and cashmere scarves of the arriving VIPs. I had left Leo in my room, bundled in every blanket we owned, strictly instructing him not to make a sound, but his fever had spiked dangerously high that afternoon. He was delirious, crying out for water, terrified of the loud music and the booming laughter echoing through the mansion's ventilation shafts. In a moment of pure, desperate instinct, Leo had wandered out of the attic. He had stumbled down the grand, sweeping spiral staircase, dragging his favorite threadbare blanket behind him. He looked like a tiny, fragile ghost, his face flushed red with fever, his bare feet pattering softly against the cold marble. He made it all the way to the grand foyer, right into the center of a group of Victoria's most prestigious guests, like billionaire investors, local politicians, and media moguls. The conversation died instantly. The string quartet in the corner faltered to a stop. The silence that fell over the grand foyer was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. Victoria, resplendent in a custom-made ice blue silk gown that cost more than a house, turned slowly. The color drained from her perfectly contoured face, replaced by a flush of absolute, unadulterated rage. She looked at Leo not as a sick, terrified child, but as a pile of garbage that had magically appeared in her pristine living room. "What?" Victoria hissed, her voice cutting through the silent room like a serrated blade. "Is this filthy creature doing in my house?" I broke every rule of my employment. I abandoned the coat check and sprinted across the foyer, throwing myself between Victoria and the trembling boy. I scooped Leo into my arms, pressing his burning cheek against my shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Miss Belmont," I said, keeping my voice low, calm, and perfectly measured, though my heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. "He's sick. He was looking for me. I'll take him away immediately." Victoria stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the marble. She looked me up and down, her lips curling into a sneer of pure disgust. "You brought a street rat into my home during my gala." She turned to the crowd, offering them an apologetic theatrical sigh. I said, "I apologize, everyone. It seems the help has forgotten their place. Good help is so impossible to find these days, aren't they? Just like animals." A few of the guests chuckled, a cruel, hollow sound that made my stomach turn. "Miss Belmont, please," I said quietly, refusing to let my voice shake. "He has a high fever. He just needs a place to sleep tonight. Tomorrow, I will make other arrangements. You certainly will, Victoria snapped, signaling to the two massive suited security guards standing by the mahogany double doors. Because you are both leaving right now, the guests murmured, a mix of shock and morbid amusement. Outside, beyond the towering floor-to-ceiling windows, a massive blizzard was raging. The wind was howling, tearing through the bare branches of the oak trees, whipping the snow into a blinding, chaotic frenzy. The temperature had plummeted to 10 degrees below zero. It was the kind of weather that killed. Victoria, a man's voice interrupted. It was Julian. Julian was the estate manager and the only person in the entire Belmont compound who possessed a shred of human decency. He was a former medical student who had dropped out to care for his own ailing mother, eventually taking the high-paying management job to clear her debts. He had always been kind to me, leaving extra portions of food in the kitchen, pretending not to notice when I slipped away to check on the attic. Julian stepped out of the crowd, his face pale, his jaw set. Victoria, you can't throw them out tonight. Look at the weather. The roads are completely impassable. The boy is clearly ill. It's a death sentence. Victoria turned her icy glare onto Julian. Are you questioning my authority in my own home, Julian, before my guests? I'm questioning your humanity, Julian shot back, stepping closer to me, shielding Leo and me with his own body. Let them stay in the basement just for tonight. I'll take full responsibility. Victoria's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. She hated being challenged, especially in front of an audience. She thrived on absolute submission. You are relieved of your duties, Julian. You're fired. Get off my property. Julian didn't flinch. He just looked at her with a profound, quiet pity. You're making a terrible mistake, Victoria. The only mistake I made was hiring soft, pathetic, bleeding hearts. She spat. She turned back to the guards. Throw all three of them out. If they resist, call the police and have them arrested for trespassing. I want this trash off my marble before the mayor arrives. If you love stories about arrogant people getting exactly what they deserve, hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what happens next. The guards were not gentle. They grabbed Julian by the arms, shoved me forward, and literally threw us out the heavy front doors. We hit the freezing, snow-covered stone of the courtyard hard. I curled my body entirely around Leo, taking the brunt of the impact on my shoulder. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind us, the deadbolts sliding into place with a loud, final echoing click. Instantly, the cold hit me like a physical blow. The wind screamed across the open courtyard, tearing through my thin cotton maid's uniform as if it were made of paper. The snow was falling so thick and fast that I could barely see the massive iron gates at the end of the driveway. Inside, through the massive, brilliantly lit glass windows of the grand ballroom, I could see Victoria. She was standing there, a flute of champagne in her hand, surrounded by her sycophants. She was looking out at us, laughing, raising her glass in a mocking toast. She watched us shiver. She enjoyed it. Elara, Julian said, his voice barely audible over the roaring wind. He had managed to keep his heavy wool overcoat, and he immediately stripped it off, wrapping it tightly around my shoulders and pulling it over Leo. We have to move. We can't stay here. We'll freeze to death in 20 minutes. Where do we go? I asked, my teeth chattering uncontrollably. The gates are locked. The perimeter wall is 10 feet high. It's a 2-mile walk down the private road just to reach the main highway, and the snow is already a foot deep. Julian gritted his teeth, pulling us toward the slight shelter of a large stone fountain in the center of the courtyard. It offered a tiny break from the brutal wind. I have my car keys. If we can break the lock on the side gate, we might be able to reach the staff parking lot. But the boy, he's burning up, Elara. He's not going to make it 2 miles in this. I looked down at Leo. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and rapid. His small hands clutching my shirt were turning a terrifying shade of blue. The fever was raging inside him, fighting a losing battle against the unnatural cold of the storm. In that moment, huddling in the snow, watching the life slowly drain from an innocent child while the elite laughed in their warm, golden ballroom, my internal conflict reached its absolute breaking point. You see, I wasn't just Ilara the maid. I hadn't been born to scrub floors or silently endure the cruelty of lesser people. My real name was Ilara Valerius. I was the granddaughter of Alexander Valerius, the supreme ruler of the Valerian Empire, a sovereign, impossibly wealthy micronation built on international shipping, advanced technology, and generations of old-world royal power. I had grown up in palaces that made the Belmont estate look like a dilapidated shack. I had been raised surrounded by armies, diplomats, and unimaginable luxury. But I had also grown up in a cage, a beautiful golden cage, but a cage nonetheless. I had been suffocated by the endless expectations, the constant surveillance, and the terrifying realization that people only loved me for the crown I would one day wear, never for the girl I actually was. 3 years ago, desperate for a normal life, desperate to know if I could survive on my own merits, I had run away. I had completely disappeared into the masses, taking a fake name, hiding my accent, and taking the lowest jobs I could find. I wanted to build a life of my own, free from the crushing weight of the Valerian dynasty. I had succeeded. I had found independence, but I had also found the ugly, brutal truth of how the world treats those it deems powerless. For 3 years, I had sworn I would never go back. I had sworn I would never use my family's power. But looking at Leo's pale, freezing face, looking at Julian shivering violently in his suit to protect us, and looking at Victoria Belmont smirking through the glass, I realized something fundamental. Power isn't inherently evil. It's the people who wield it that determine its nature. Victoria used her tiny, insignificant fraction of power to crush the weak. If I let Leo die simply to protect my own pride, to protect my desire for an ordinary life, I was no better than her. Underneath my right glove, on my index finger, I wore a heavy platinum ring. It was a signet ring, deeply engraved with the roaring lion crest of the Valerian royal family. But it wasn't just jewelry. It was a masterpiece of Valerian engineering. Hidden beneath the crest was a biometric distress beacon, tied directly to the Empire's global satellite network and the Supreme Ruler's personal guard. If I activated it, my grandfather would know exactly where I was. He would descend upon this place with the full, terrifying might of the Empire. My quiet life would be over forever. I would be thrust back into the spotlight, back onto the throne. I looked at Leo again. He let out a weak, rattling breath, his chest barely rising. There was no choice. Whirf. I pulled off my wet, freezing glove. The platinum ring caught the faint, ambient light from the ballroom windows. Julian, noticing my movement, looked down at my hand. His eyes widened in absolute shock as he recognized the sheer quality and design of the piece. Ilara, what is that? Julian asked, his voice trembling not just from the cold, but from sudden, profound confusion. Julian, I said, my voice steadying, the freezing wind suddenly feeling like nothing at all against the ancient royal blood burning in my veins. Thank you for seeing us, for standing up for us when you had everything to lose. Ilara, I don't understand. I didn't explain. I didn't have the time. I placed my thumb over the crest of the lion. I pressed down hard and twisted the crest 90 degrees clockwise. A tiny, almost imperceptible red light pulsed once, twice, 3 times beneath the metal before turning a solid, steady green. The signal was sent. The beacon was active, the ghost was dead, and the air was awake. I wrapped my glove back over my hand and held Leo tighter. "Hold on, little one," I whispered into his hair. "Just hold on a little longer. The storm is about to change." If you're loving this story so far, and trust me, this is where it gets incredibly good, don't go anywhere. Subscribe now because the climax is about to shatter everything. We waited in the snow for exactly 14 minutes. Inside the grand ballroom, the gala had reached its peak. The mayor had arrived, and Victoria was standing on the grand sweeping staircase, delivering a speech to the adoring crowd. I could see her gesturing gracefully, her diamond necklace sparkling under the chandeliers. She was at the absolute zenith of her perceived power, a queen ruling over her pathetic, shimmering kingdom. She occasionally glanced out the window, perhaps hoping to see our frozen bodies in the snow, a grim testament to her absolute authority. She didn't see bodies. She saw the sky tear open. It started as a low, deep vibration, a thrumming that seemed to rise from the very earth itself, vibrating through the stone courtyard, shaking the icy water in the fountain. Julian looked around in panic, thinking it was an earthquake. Inside the ballroom, the guests paused, their champagne flutes rattling lightly against the tables. Victoria stopped speaking, a look of mild irritation crossing her face as the crystal chandeliers above her began to sway. Then, the sound hit. It was the deafening, thunderous roar of military-grade helicopter rotors. Not one, but four massive, matte-black transport helicopters descended through the raging blizzard, as if the storm itself was parting for them. Their blinding, high-intensity spotlights cut through the darkness, sweeping over the estate, illuminating the snow in stark, terrifying white light. The helicopters didn't land gently. They slammed down onto the pristine, manicured lawns and the grand courtyard, kicking up a massive hurricane of snow and ice. Before the rotors even began to slow down, the side doors of the helicopters violently slid open. Dozens of elite Valerian royal guards poured out. They were terrifying in their precision. They wore heavy tactical winter gear, scarlet coats over black armor, detailed with heavy gold braiding that gleamed under the spotlights. They carried assault rifles, their faces hidden behind dark tactical visors. They moved with absolute, silent, lethal efficiency. In seconds, they had surrounded the courtyard, forming a massive, impenetrable perimeter. Two squads broke off, marching with heavy, synchronized steps directly toward the locked iron gates of the estate. They didn't bother asking for the key. A guard attached a small shaped charge to the lock. A second later, a loud crack echoed through the night, and the heavy iron gates were blasted completely open. Through the smoke and the falling snow, a massive convoy of 10 armored black SUVs rolled onto the property. They drove in perfect formation, their tires crunching heavily over the gravel and snow, until they formed a semicircle directly in front of the grand entrance of the mansion, boxing us and the party inside completely in. Inside the ballroom, absolute pandemonium had broken out. The guests were screaming, backing away from the windows in sheer terror. They thought it was a military raid. They thought they were under attack. Victoria stood frozen on the staircase, the color completely drained from her face, her jaw slack, her arrogant composure shattered into a million pieces. The glass of champagne slipped from her trembling fingers, shattering against the marble floor. A sound lost in the roar of the engines outside. The central SUV, a vehicle that looked more like a tank than a car, came to a slow halt. The engine cut off. The guards immediately formed two perfectly straight lines leading from the door of the SUV directly to where I sat by the fountain holding Leo. The rear door of the SUV opened. Stepping out into the freezing Boston night was a man who commanded the very air around him. It was Duke Alaric, the supreme ruler's right-hand man, the commander of the Valerian military, and the man who had taught me how to walk, how to ride, and how to rule. He was in full ceremonial military dress, a long, heavy black greatcoat draped over his broad shoulders, a chest full of genuine battle medals, and a silver sword resting at his hip. His face was weathered, stern, and carried an expression of absolute, terrifying fury. He didn't look at the mansion. He didn't look at the terrified elite cowering behind the glass. He walked directly toward me, his boots crunching loudly in the snow. The guards snapped to attention, raising their weapons in a salute. Julian, who was standing beside me, was completely paralyzed, his mouth hanging open in pure shock. He looked from the army to the Duke and finally down to me, sitting in the snow in my torn maid's uniform. Duke Alaric stopped 3 feet in front of me. The stern, furious expression melted from his face, replaced by a look of profound, overwhelming relief. Tears welled in the old warrior's eyes. Slowly, deliberately, the commander of the Valerian Empire sank to one knee in the deep snow. He bowed his head deeply. "Your Highness," Duke Alaric said, his deep, resonant voice carrying perfectly over the dying hum of the helicopters. "The supreme ruler sends his love. The Empire rejoices. We have finally found you, Princess Alara." The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavier than the blizzard. It was the sound of a world shifting on its axis. I looked down at the Duke. I gently adjusted Julian's coat around Leo, ensuring the boy was completely covered before I slowly stood up. My legs were numb from the cold, but my posture was perfect. 3 years of scrubbing floors vanished in an instant, replaced by the lifelong training of a sovereign. I stood tall, my chin raised, the absolute authority of the Valerian bloodline radiating from me. "Rise, Alaric," I said, my voice carrying the steady, calm command of a ruler. "I am glad to see you, but we have urgent matters. This child requires immediate, world-class medical attention. He is under my direct personal protection." Alaric stood instantly. "At once, Your Highness." He snapped his fingers. Immediately, a team of Valerian combat medics rushed forward from the second helicopter, carrying a heated stretcher and advanced medical equipment. They gently took Leo from my arms. I watched as they wrapped him in thermal blankets, placed an oxygen mask over his small face, and hurried him into the waiting medical SUV. "Julian," I said, turning to the stunned estate manager, "go with him, ensure they have everything they need. You are officially the chief medical officer of my personal household, if you wish to accept the position." Julian blinked, utterly bewildered, but his medical instincts kicked in. Yes, Your Highness." He bowed awkwardly, then sprinted after the medics. Once Leo was safe, I turned my attention to the mansion. The heavy oak doors of the grand entrance were suddenly thrown open. The Valerian guards had breached the lobby. The elite guests were backed against the walls, terrified, silent, and standing in the doorway, shivering violently in the cold air, was Victoria Belmont. She looked like a ghost. Her flawless makeup was smudged, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it bordered on madness. She looked at the army. She looked at Duke Alaric, and finally her gaze landed on me, the maid she had just ordered thrown into the snow to die, the trash she had mocked. I walked slowly toward her, flanked by Duke Alaric and 4 heavily armed guards. The snow crunched under my cheap, worn-out shoes, but I walked with the stride of an empress. Victoria took a stumbling step backward. Her knees actually buckled, and she collapsed onto the threshold of her own home, looking up at me from the ground. "Is Alara?" she stammered, her voice high-pitched and broken. What is this? Who are you?" Duke Alaric stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. His voice boomed through the grand foyer, echoing off the marble walls for every single guest, politician, and socialite to hear clearly. "You are addressing Her Royal Highness, Crown Princess Alara Valerius, sole heir to the supreme ruler of the Valyrian Empire, commander of the Sovereign Order, and the future ruler of 50 million souls. You will lower your eyes and you will show respect." The words landed like physical blows. I watched the realization physically crush Victoria. Her breath hitched. The arrogance, the cruelty, the petty power she had wielded, it all evaporated into absolute nothingness against the monolithic weight of true, undeniable authority. "Your Highness," Victoria gasped, tears of pure terror spilling down her cheeks. She scrambled forward, reaching out a trembling hand toward my shoe, desperate to apologize, desperate to salvage her ruined life. "I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know who you were. If I had known—" I stepped back, ensuring her hand touched only the cold snow. I looked down at her. I didn't yell, I didn't scream, I didn't let a single ounce of anger show on my face. True power never needs to raise its voice. "That is exactly the point, Victoria," I said, my voice calm, measured, and utterly devastating. "You didn't want to know. You chose cruelty when kindness cost you absolutely nothing. You judged a sick, dying child and a tired worker by the clothes they wore and the bank accounts they held." "Please," she sobbed, completely broken in front of her entire social circle. "Please forgive me. I can make it right. I'll give you anything. I'll give the boy anything." "These are simply consequences," I replied coldly, my eyes locked onto hers. "You revealed exactly who you are tonight. Worth isn't measured in stock portfolios, family trees, or designer gowns. It is measured by how you treat those who can do nothing for you. You have shown the world your true worth, and it is entirely bankrupt." I looked up, addressing the silent, terrified crowd of elites in the ballroom. "The Belmont family's assets within the Valyrian Empire's jurisdictions, which, I believe, account for 80% of your global shipping contracts, are hereby frozen indefinitely, pending a full investigation into unethical practices. This estate will be purchased by the Empire tomorrow morning at a fraction of its cost, and it will be converted into a free children's hospital." The collective gasp from the room was music to my ears. Victoria let out a broken wail, burying her face in her hands. She had just lost everything. Her money, her status, her home, her reputation, all in the span of 5 minutes. "I really won't regret this," I said quietly, looking down at her one last time. I turned away completely. I didn't look back. I took Duke Alaric's offered arm, and together we walked back through the snow toward the waiting convoy. The guards fell into perfect step behind us. The doors of the SUV closed, sealing out the cold, the snow, and the pathetic, broken sobbing of a tyrant who had finally met her match. Trust me, you won't believe how this story concludes. 2 years later, the sun was shining brilliantly over the crystal-clear waters of the Valyrian coastline. The capital city was alive with the sound of music, laughter, and the ringing of cathedral bells. I stood on the grand balcony of the summer palace, the warm sea breeze gently tugging at the edges of my white silk gown. I was no longer Alara the maid. I had fully embraced my title, my heritage, and my responsibilities. My grandfather, the supreme ruler, had welcomed me back with tears of joy, finally understanding why I had left and promising to help me reform the empire into a place of compassion rather than just power. A small, energetic blur of motion sprinted onto the balcony. "Mom!" It was Leo. He was 8 years old now. The pale, fragile, dying boy from the snowy courtyard was completely gone. In his place was a vibrant, healthy, incredibly happy child with bright eyes and a mischievous smile. He wore a miniature royal uniform, running wildly, chasing a golden retriever puppy across the marble floor. My grandfather had officially adopted him into the royal family, granting him the title of Duke. But to me, he was simply my son. "Slow down, Leo," a warm, familiar voice called out, laughing. Julian stepped onto the balcony, catching the boy and swinging him up onto his shoulders. Julian looked drastically different from the freezing estate manager. He was dressed in the sharp, elegant attire of the chief of royal medicine, but more importantly, he looked entirely at peace. He walked over to me, wrapping his free arm around my waist and pressing a soft kiss to my temple. "He has too much energy today," Julian smiled, looking out over the sprawling city. "He's healthy," I smiled back, leaning into him. "That's all that matters." Julian had stood by my side through the intense, overwhelming transition back into royal life. He had proven, time and time again, that he loved the woman who scrubbed floors just as much as he loved the crown princess. We were to be married in the spring. As for Victoria Belmont, the news occasionally reported on her, stripped of her immense wealth and social standing, completely ostracized by the elite circle she had so desperately tried to impress. She was forced to work. The last article I saw mentioned she had taken a job as a junior clerk in a retail store in a rainy, forgotten town. She spent her days serving people she used to mock, utterly invisible, entirely forgotten. The Belmont estate in Boston was now the Valerian Hope Children's Hospital, entirely funded, fully staffed, and currently saving thousands of lives every single year. Every time I looked at Leo, I was reminded of the freezing dark and the choice I had made. Listen closely, because this is the truth of the world. Worth exists entirely independent of recognition. The crown on my finger didn't make me better than the maid scrubbing the floor. It simply gave me the volume to make the world listen. The right person, the truly good people like Julian, will see your worth long before they know your status. Cruelty is a mirror. It always reveals the profound insecurity and ugliness of the perpetrator, never the victim. True victory isn't found in petty revenge. It is found in living well, in thriving, and in using whatever power you have to pull others up from the cold. Real love is shown by showing up in the most inconvenient, desperate moments. Have you ever been underestimated by someone who only looked at your surface? Drop a comment below and share your story.
If this narrative resonated with you, hit that subscribe button, share this video, and remember, your story isn't over yet.